So what we're seeing in the region is growing the manifestations of anti-rights and anti-gender movements and actors, and them growing in popularity, growing in visibility, growing in political influence. And that is contributing to an environment that's encouraging criminalization on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, or gender expression. And not only criminalization of acts or identity, but also criminalization of advocacy, criminalization of freedom of speech related to the questions. And so, I give an example of Ghana, where what we're seeing in the region, and Ghana is a prime example, is an attempt to advance criminalization, and that is much more extensive than what we've seen in the past. So in the past, when you look at most of the countries that have laws on the books that criminalize, which for the most part are colonial heritage, colonial inheritance, it criminalizes acts. But what we see in the bill, for example, the Proper Human Sexual Rights in Ghanaian Family Values Bill, which was assented to by the Ghanaian Parliament earlier this year, is that the bill is much broader. So not only are we criminalizing behavior, but we're also criminalizing identity. We're criminalizing any free speech related to questions around sexual orientation, diversity, diverse OGS. So an impact on what can be said and what can be talked about in public spaces, on the media, in movies, the entertainment industry. We're seeing criminalization. That criminalization also extends to service delivery, to advocacy, but also to funding, which has a big impact. And that it would not only touch the community, but anyone around the community. And so including landlords who don't report, parents, anyone who knowingly is employing an LGBTQI or person from the LGBTQI community. So very broad, like this criminalization is not like what we've seen in the past. It's much more extensive. And what we know is that there's a domino effect. So because of the geopolitical dynamics as well, when things happen in one country, there's a ripple effect across the region. We saw that 10 years ago with the passage of the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act in Nigeria in 2014, where we start to then see the conversation then start in Ghana. We see it evolve in Liberia. Similarly, in Ghana from 2021, 2022, we're starting to see the ripple effect. And what does it mean when a country like Ghana, that has historically known in the region as a stable democracy, a human rights champion, is saying we actually, not only do we want to criminalize LGBTQ people and issues, but we need to criminalize LGBTQI people, advocacy. So what does that mean, and what message does that send for the rest of the region? So the ripple effect is huge. And so we're now seeing that there really are no countries that are safe. So countries like my own, Cote d'Ivoire, which historically has been seen as more progressive on these issues, we're starting to see that shift. We're countries like Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire that have never had criminalizing bills. There's now a push and a call for actually those countries, those governments to criminalize. It's important to note what we've seen is that there are the local homegrown actors, but there's also an influence of external factors and external actors, including resources around money, but also resources around spaces and spaces that move certain ideologies. So for example, in Cote d'Ivoire in June, just 2 months ago, the Mormon Church held their 6th Strengthening Families Conference. And when you look at it, you look at the website, you look at all the information, none of it says any anti-anything. It's all pro-family, pro-African values, pro-strengthening marriage. Of course, who doesn't want a strong family? Who doesn't want a strong marriage for those who are married? And so there's a way in which that language is being used to then talk about what is an ideal world, what is an ideal family, and promoting fighting against anything that is not that. And so while this conference is seemingly, it had a lot of endorsers. It was co-sponsored by the Ministry of Women, Family, and Childhood. You had some of the leading women's rights organizations that were there, including the Association of Female Lawyers. And so it's got great co-sponsorship. But but the agenda that's behind it, and the ways in which it contributes to the environment that is supporting and fostering and enabling further criminalization is really, really worrying. It's not surprising that 2 months later in Cote d'Ivoire, we're seeing very extensive hate speech against the community online. We're seeing calls where people are trying to organize marches to rid the country of gay people. We're seeing calls where people are pushing the government to actually rid the country of LGBTQI people and saying it's time for the government to act. So while the connection isn't always direct or clear, what we're learning is that there is a connection, and the ways in which certain spaces are created also are enabling a spreading of a certain kind of discourse, of a certain kind of way of organizing. Criminalization is also being used as a political tool. And so, for example, in Ghana last year, I remember in the newspaper, they're reading about some of the calls that politicians were making to people to say, make sure that you re-elect those members of parliament that introduced that bill so they can finish the job. So make sure you re-elect them to parliament. In Senegal, we saw that last year with the party that's now in power. One of the platforms of which they ran on, and very close connection to some of the local anti-gender actors, is using a platform of, when we're in power, we are going to secure the country. We're going to make sure that the country's values are intact. We're going to fight against anything that's against that, including homosexuality. So the use of LGBTQI persons and communities and issues as a political tool, as an electoral tool, and we're seeing that across multiple countries in the region. It's important to note that there's a broader context of anti-democratic practices and authoritarian regimes with coups d'etats. So across the region in the last 2-3 years, we've seen coups d'etats happen. When you look at countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, which have actually created their own separate economic and political bloc called IRS, across all 3 countries, there are laws in discussion right now related to criminalization of communities. And all 3 countries, politicians who are in power have announced an intention to criminalize LGBTQI communities and LGBTQI organizing and issues. And this is often positioned in the agenda of being of domestic sovereignty, of fighting against foreign influence, particularly France and French influence or European influence. It's seen as countering foreign influence, countering neocolonialism. And so there's a way, again, that criminalization is then, and the possibility of criminalization is being introduced as like, this is part of a localizing, this is a part of an Africanizing, this is a part of a taking our power back agenda. And so it's very hard for people who believe in an anti-colonialist struggle, because then there's that piece. But also just recognizing that across many in civil society and many of the general public, of course that resonates. And so the ways in which LGBTQI issues then get conflated with foreign influence or Western influence or French influence is very much the dynamic and very much contributes to advancing the discourse around criminalization. And these are in contexts that have become increasingly authoritarian, where we're seeing attacks on freedom of expression, freedom of the press, where journalists are disappearing. And so anything that seemed to be counter what the state is saying or the state wants to do is at risk. And it also means that advocacy that was possible 4 or 5 years ago, or to try to push back or at least to safeguard, is no longer possible. I think it's important to note that it's not only rhetoric. So we know that people are taking the law into their own hands. So even when a law doesn't exist, even when there's not a criminal law that exists, sometimes there's a discourse and an understanding that actually the law already exists. And in Ghana, we're seeing that happen a lot. We're seeing that happen in countries where the government has introduced or talked about introducing a law where people are taking the law into their own hands. And so what we're seeing is more targeted attacks and threats on particularly trans people, but also people who are seen to be more broadly transgressing gender norms. And so increased number of attacks and unfortunately and maddeningly murders of trans people across the region, Nigeria, Burkina, etc. The important thing is also that the movement is organizing, and I think it's important in all of this context. We're talking about the challenges, but also to recognize that movement organizations are organizing. They are finding ways to do advocacy. They are trying to change the narrative, but it's tough. It's a tough environment. And misinformation, disinformation campaigns are contributing to fueling this climate, especially the use of TikTok as a platform where we have also been involved in getting accounts shut down on TikTok. But what we know is things just blossom. So you get an account shut down, by the afternoon that person or those actors are back on outing people or inciting violence. So the misinformation, the disinformation that's happening on social media is also contributing to this environment. And in many of the countries where either we're going to elections or there's new people in power, there is also this pressure to show that government is working, to show that people are serious, that government is working. And so part of how you show government is working is you're putting into, when people on TikTok are saying, hey, the government needs to be pushing for stronger laws, the government needs to drive people out. Of course, it's popular, it becomes a very popular populist move to say, okay, we're going to make sure that LGBTQI people and issues are criminalized because they are the source of problems. So again, there's this environment that's contributing to criminalization that we're seeing across the region, and especially in places like in Burkina Faso, in Cote d'Ivoire. We've seen the influence of the TikTok organizing, the influence of social media for disinformation, misinformation, but also very quick mobilizing and organizing around anti-LGBTQI marches, etc. And I think the last thing I'll mention around this is that one of the consequences of the environment, what we're seeing is there's greater division between movements. And so there's a siloing of LGBTQI communities and issues are the ones that get us in trouble, especially with broader feminist movements in many of the countries. And so whereas the source of our attacks are coming from the same place, there's a level of silos, there's a level of divisions, there's a level of disconnect that's also happening. And so I reflect on the conversation, the discourse in the Gambia earlier this year, where members of government wanted to repeal the anti-FGM law. A lot of the justification, the rhetoric around justification of this was preserving African values, preserving traditional values, preserving African culture. That is the exact same rhetoric that's being used to justify advancing and pushing for new criminal laws in Mali, in Burkina, in Niger, in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Nigeria, and Liberia. So these are some of the context and some of what we're seeing in the region. Unfortunately, in the international space, oftentimes there are certain countries and certain regions that get a lot more attention in advocacy spaces, but also a lot more attention philanthropically. And so I am pleased to have an opportunity to talk about West Africa as a region, but in particular to elevate the ways in which certain parts of West Africa, including Francophone countries, including the Sahel region, where there's particular dynamics and a particular reality that is influencing our organizing environment. I hope that this is helpful, and also happy to engage with people via email and continue the conversation. Our website is www.isdao, and my email address is caroline@isdao.org. Thank you so much.